Welcome to WordWise. We delve deeply in the Word of God, discover what it means and how to apply it to our lives. We're continuing to discuss some divine appointments in the book of Acts. Today is an interesting one, a divine appointment that reminds us that we're not in this alone, that God often provides people, other believers, to help us as we go about His work and what He calls us to do. We're often supported and encouraged by others of the faith as well. And that kind of divine appointment is what we see as Paul first arrives in the city of Corinth, which is another city in modern-day Greece, this time in southern Greece, Achaia. And Paul has traveled to Athens and now on to Corinth as we begin chapter 18, looking at verses 1 through 8, some interesting divine appointments as Paul continues to do what God calls him to do. Read with us Acts 18, 1 through 8.
Then Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he became acquainted with a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently arrived from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They had left Italy when Claudius Caesar deported all Jews from Rome. Paul lived and worked with them, for they were tent makers just as he was. Each Sabbath found Paul at the synagogue, trying to convince the Jews and Greeks alike. And after Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul spent all his time preaching the word. He testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed and insulted him, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, "Your blood is upon your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go preach to the Gentiles." Then he left and went to the home of Titius Justus, a Gentile who worshipped God and lived next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, and everyone in the household believed in the Lord. Many others in Corinth also heard Paul, became believers, and were baptized.
So as we begin, the reality is Paul continues a pattern we've seen on numerous occasions. When he comes to a new city, he goes first to the Jews. He goes to the synagogue. If the town is big enough to have a synagogue, Paul goes first there to share about Jesus. But in this city, he's not doing it alone. If you noticed, he had left behind a lot of his missionary team. In various places, they had been stationed back to help the young churches that had begun. And Paul, by the time he reaches Corinth, you kind of think he's the only member of his missionary team there, and that's true. But God doesn't allow him to be alone for too long. He meets up with a couple that will prove very helpful to him over the years, Priscilla and Aquila. These two individuals are first introduced to us here in Acts 18, and Paul's not alone. As he goes to the synagogue and shares about Jesus, he has support from this new couple, a married couple named Priscilla and Aquila. All we know about them is they were Jews that had come to Christ at some point, but they were still exiled and deported from Rome under the Emperor Claudius. We know that Claudius reigned from 41 to 54, so we're not sure exactly when that deportation happened, but the late 40s is what we think happened. At some point, he, for political reasons, exiled the Jews out of Rome, and these two ended up in Corinth and crossing paths with Paul. Just because God sets these divine appointments at times when we need them, people to come alongside and encourage and to help. This couple would have invested in Paul relationally and encouraged him. And notice what else it mentions, that they also have a trade. Paul, at this point, is supporting himself when he's on this mission, sometimes by working as a tent maker, of creating his own industry to make sure he's paying his own way when there's not support available any other way, or when he chooses not to take that support. He's working to support himself by being a tent maker. Priscilla and Aquila were in that same trade. They also had that practice to support themselves. So not only do they work together, but now they're having the opportunity to serve together and work together on a daily basis. And most likely that's who Paul was encouraged by as he starts this difficult time in the city of Corinth. We know from other scriptures he's there at least a year and a half, ministering in a very pagan city, a very difficult city, was rampant with pagan worship and idolatry and a sexual culture that would have been very difficult for him to minister. But yet, he stays put and is doing what God calls him to do. And his first encouragements are from this couple, Priscilla and Aquila, who work with him daily, making their tents and practicing their trade, but also encouraging him as he goes to the synagogue on a regular basis to share in a very hostile environment there as well. And notice what's interesting is he's going there weekly, probably when he can on the Sabbath, but the other days he's working until Silas and Timothy arrive. His missionary team now is back together. They've returned from their various assignments, and Paul is able to now devote himself fully to sharing the gospel on a daily basis. The implication there is that Silas and Timothy, along with Priscilla and Aquila, they now form a great support team for Paul to free him up to daily be sharing the word of God in the Jewish synagogue and around that area. So he's supported fully. Again, the divine appointments God arranges when we need the help the most is when he brings other believers alongside to support and encourage as we do what God calls us to do. Paul's obedient, just trying to do what he's supposed to do. And it doesn't go very well. If you notice verse 6, he's met with hostility and insults and not only people arguing with him, but now insulting him and getting close to violence even. That happened on a regular basis sometimes. In Thessalonica, we know he was chased out by vicious people who were against the message of Jesus and were not only insulting and arguing with him, but then getting violent. In other cities that happened too. Begins to happen here, and Paul short circuits it essentially in verse 6 by basically saying, you know what? I know this is not going to go anywhere anymore. I'm going to shake the dust from my clothes. That's a proverbial imagery to say this is now a closed door. So I'm going to go preach the word of God to the Gentiles. He's going to focus just on now the Gentiles in Corinth, the much broader field of ministry in a sense. He's done his job of going first to the Jews. He's tried to proclaim the gospel to the Jews who would have had the Old Testament, who would have had the most knowledge about the prophecies about Jesus. He's done his best to win those to Jesus. And then he's now, because of the opposition, realizing he needs to focus his energies elsewhere. The efforts he needs to invest now need to be in the Gentiles. So what's interesting, verse 7 and 8, he goes next door to a probably well-known Gentile one who's become a follower of Jesus. Similar to the Ethiopian eunuch we read about in Acts chapter 8 and others, Cornelius and others Gentiles that have come to Christ, first as God-fearers, as those who were seeking Yahweh through the Jewish faith, but then when they understood about Jesus, they become Christians, and they're some of the first believers to come from Gentile background into believing fully in Jesus. So another one of these is mentioned here, and he's probably a prominent citizen of Corinth and geographically located fairly close to the synagogue, a pretty advantageous place for Paul to still be ministering to those who from the synagogue, from a Jewish background, may still have questions and still be seeking. And that's what we read in verse 8. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, yet another leader of a synagogue, probably similar to Jairus. Back in Mark 5, you can read about him, a leader of a synagogue, an official, maybe not a priest or any kind of official rabbi, but more an administrator, a leader, an executive in the synagogue. He has had curiosity about Jesus. And verse 8 says he comes to know Christ. Most likely because Paul has been freed up from being in the synagogue. Now he's in a place where he can spend a lot of time. Probably answers all of Crispus's questions, and all of that seeking leads to this person becoming a Christian, and not only that, his entire household. And he's baptized, and his whole household is baptized, echoes of the Philippian jailer. When one comes to faith in a home, sometimes that helps so many others come to faith as well. So great things are happening, and then verse 8 tells us many came to Christ, both Jews and Gentiles, who had been seeking knowledge of God, and through Paul's ministry, through Paul's work, they come to Christ, and it's a fruitful ministry. And you can read further that he's there for at least 1.5 years, and God is doing amazing things. Later, he'll write 2 letters back to the churches that grow up in Corinth, and he's able to help them and keep them back on the straight and narrow from wandering just a bit. But he's going to do some amazing ministry to them later. But here, as the church begins, you see how God arranged all these divine appointments, how God brought the right support around Paul, Priscilla and Aquila, a couple to encourage him and help him in his vocational work, but also in his ministry work. He brought Timothy and Silas back, the missionary team back together, to fully impact this city and fully impact those who needed to know Jesus. God is at work, and God is working in all things, but sometimes it's helpful to know those divine appointments are going to be arranged just when you need them most. So brothers and sisters, as you continue on your journey, look for those people that will cross your path that God may be bringing around you to encourage you, support you, to continue to be obedient, to continue to follow and faithfully do your best to love God, to love others, and to make the light of Christ known in your neighborhood or in your family. Continue to know that God is at work to help you and strengthen you. Look for those divine appointments and continue to be WordWise. Thanks for joining us.